I didn't yell at him, I didn't confront him, and I definitely didn't give him a warning. I just smiled, waved like a normal neighbor, and quietly collected every single thing he threw into my yard for 5 years straight. Then one evening, when the sun went down and the neighborhood got quiet, I returned it all piece by piece until there was nothing left on my side of the fence. If you've ever dealt with someone who disrespected you over and over again, thinking you'd never notice or never fight back, then this story is going to feel way too satisfying. So go ahead, hit like, subscribe, and settle in because this isn't just revenge. This is patience turned into something unforgettable. I've never been the type of person who looks for problems. In fact, if anything, I go out of my way to avoid them. Life already feels like a constant balancing act, work draining every ounce of energy out of me, sleep schedules completely messed up because of night shifts, and the quiet pressure of just trying to keep everything together without falling apart. The last thing I ever wanted was unnecessary conflict, especially with someone I had to live next to every single day. So, when I moved into that house, I made a silent promise to myself. Keep your head down, mind your business, and protect your peace no matter what. And for a while, it actually worked. The neighborhood was calm, almost too calm sometimes, the kind of place where nothing really happens and everyone just exists in their own little bubble. My backyard became my escape, a small but comforting space where I could breathe, think, and momentarily forget how exhausting everything else felt. A tall wooden fence surrounded it, giving me just enough privacy to feel like the outside world couldn't reach me there. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and that mattered more than anything. But peace like that, it never really lasts, does it? Because one random afternoon, something so small and insignificant happened that I didn't even realize at the time it was going to turn into years of silent frustration. I was mowing the lawn, headphones in, half focused on the music and half lost in my own thoughts, when suddenly the mower made this sharp, jarring sound and jerked slightly to one side. I immediately stopped, thinking I had run over a rock or maybe a piece of wood. But when I bent down to check, it wasn't a rock. It was a bone. A thick, chewed up, dirty piece of bone, the kind you'd give to a large dog. For a second, I just stared at it, trying to process what I was even looking at because it didn't make sense. How does something like that just end up in the middle of a fenced backyard? I remember letting out a quiet, confused breath and muttering to myself, "Okay, that's weird," before grabbing a tissue, picking it up, and tossing it into the trash. And just like that, I moved on. At least I tried to. Because a few weeks later, it happened again. Another bone, almost identical, lying near the fence this time. That's when a tiny seed of suspicion planted itself in my mind, but I pushed it down just as quickly. I told myself it was nothing, that there had to be some random explanation, something harmless and coincidental. I didn't want to believe someone was actually throwing trash into my yard on purpose. That felt personal, and I wasn't ready to accept that. So I ignored it again. But then it kept happening. Not every day, not even every week, but just often enough that I couldn't completely forget about it. Every month or so, I'd find another one. Sometimes I'd spot it while cutting the grass, sometimes while just walking around, and every time it was the same story, chewed, discarded, and completely out of place. Slowly, that confusion I felt in the beginning started to turn into something heavier, something harder to ignore. Because my yard was fully fenced. There were no gaps, no broken panels, no way for random animals to just wander in and drop things like that. And out of all the houses around me, only one neighbor had dogs big enough to leave behind bones like those. The house right behind mine. An older man lived there, someone I had barely interacted with in the years I'd been there. I'd seen him maybe 2 or 3 times in total, always at a distance, always keeping to himself. There was something about him that felt off. Not in an obvious way, but in that subtle, quiet way that makes you feel unwelcome without a single word being said. He never waved, never acknowledged me, never even looked in my direction long enough to make eye contact. It was like I didn't exist to him. And yet, every time I found one of those bones, it was closer to his side of the fence. Still, I had no proof. And, without proof, I felt stuck. I could confront him, sure. But what would I even say? "Hey, are you throwing dog bones into my yard?" It sounded ridiculous even in my own head. And if I was wrong, I'd just end up looking paranoid and creating tension for no reason. But if I was right, then that meant someone was deliberately disrespecting my space over and over again, assuming I'd either never notice or never do anything about it. And for some reason, that thought bothered me more than the bones themselves. It wasn't about the inconvenience anymore. It was about what it meant. The lack of consideration, the quiet entitlement, the assumption that my space didn't matter. That I didn't matter. So instead of confronting him, instead of starting something I wasn't sure I could finish, I made a different decision. A quieter one. I started keeping them. At first, it was just out of convenience. I didn't feel like walking all the way out to the main trash every time I found one, so I grabbed a small plastic container from my storage area and tossed the bone in there, telling myself I'd deal with it later. But later never came, because every time I opened that container and saw another bone added to the pile, something inside me shifted just a little more. What started as a random collection slowly turned into something else entirely. It became a record. A silent log of every single time my space had been disrespected. And the more it filled up, the harder it became to ignore what was happening. Weeks turned into months, months into years, and that container kept growing heavier, not just physically, but emotionally. Every new bone felt like a quiet message being sent over that fence, one I was never meant to respond to. And for a long time, I didn't. I just kept collecting, kept watching, kept waiting. Because deep down, even if I didn't fully admit it to myself yet, I knew this wasn't something I was going to let go forever. At first, I told myself I was overthinking it, that maybe I was connecting dots that weren't really there. But the longer it went on, the harder it became to ignore the pattern. These bones weren't random anymore. They were consistent, deliberate, almost routine. Every time I stepped into my backyard, there was this quiet tension sitting in my chest, like I was walking into a space that didn't fully belong to me anymore. I'd scan the grass without even realizing it, my eyes automatically checking near the fence, bracing myself for what I might find. And more often than not, I'd find something. Sometimes it was half buried in the grass, sometimes just lying there in plain sight like it had been carelessly tossed without a second thought. Each one looked the same, chewed down, used, and discarded like it had no value left. Kind of like the way my yard was being treated. I started noticing how it made me feel in the moment. That small pause when I spotted one. The slight clench in my jaw. The way my shoulders would tense up without me even thinking about it. It wasn't just annoyance anymore, it was something deeper. It was disrespect. And the worst part? It was silent. No confrontation, no words, no acknowledgement. Just this ongoing, passive act that kept happening again and again, like I wasn't even worth the basic courtesy of being considered. At night, lying in bed after a long shift, my mind would drift back to it. I'd replay it over and over, trying to make sense of why someone would do something like that. Was he just lazy? Did he think it was harmless? Or did he know exactly what he was doing and just didn't care? That last thought stayed with me the longest. Because if he didn't care, then why should I keep pretending it didn't matter? Still, I didn't act. Not yet. Instead, I kept observing. I started paying closer attention to timing. When I'd find the bones, what time of day it was, what I remembered hearing the night before. Small details that didn't seem important at first, but slowly started forming a clearer picture. Most of the time, it happened on days when I wasn't home during the evening. Nights when I was at work, stuck in that endless cycle of artificial lights and exhaustion. Nights when no one would be around to see anything. Convenient timing. That realization made something shift inside me. Because now it didn't feel random anymore. It felt intentional. Like he knew exactly when to do it. Like he was counting on the fact that I wouldn't be there. And suddenly, the idea of confronting him felt pointless. What was I going to say? He could deny it easily. Act confused. Maybe even flip it around and make me look crazy. And without actually seeing him do it, I had nothing solid to stand on. No proof. Just a container full of bones and a gut feeling that refused to go away. So I stayed quiet. But inside, that quiet was starting to change. It wasn't avoidance anymore. It was patience. Because every time I added another bone to that container, I wasn't just cleaning up my yard. I was collecting evidence. Building something. holding on to every small piece of disrespect that had been thrown my way. And slowly, without even realizing it, I stopped thinking about if I would do something and started thinking about when. There were moments where I almost broke, days where I'd come home exhausted, already irritated from work, only to find another one waiting for me like some kind of silent insult. I remember one evening in particular. The sun was setting, casting this orange glow across the yard, and for a second it looked peaceful, almost beautiful, until I saw it, right near the fence, fresh, like it had just been thrown. I stood there longer than usual that time, just staring at it, my hands slowly curling into fists, nails pressing into my palms. I could feel my heartbeat in my chest, heavy and slow, like something was building up inside me that I couldn't release. Seriously? I whispered under my breath. That was the moment it stopped being small. That was the moment it stopped being something I could ignore. Because it wasn't just about bones anymore. It was about boundaries. And mine were being crossed over and over again without consequence. I bent down, picked it up, and walked over to the container. When I opened the lid, I paused. For the first time, I really looked at what I had collected over the years. There were so many. Way more than I ever realized. Stacked, layered, filling up the space like a physical reminder of every single time I chose to stay silent. And standing there, holding that latest piece in my hand, something clicked. A quiet, steady realization. If he could throw them over one by one without thinking twice, then I could return them the exact same way. Just not one by one. All at once. I closed the lid slowly, a faint smile forming on my face for the first time since this whole thing started. Because now, finally, I knew exactly what I was going to do. By the time that thought settled into my mind, it didn't feel impulsive or emotional anymore. It felt calm, almost calculated. And that's what scared me the most, because I'm not the kind of person who plans things like that. I don't sit around thinking about revenge or how to get back at people, but this wasn't just anger anymore. This was something that had been quietly building for years. Something that had been fed piece by piece every time I bent down, picked up another bone, and chose silence over confrontation. And now that silence had turned into clarity, because the truth was, I didn't just suspect him anymore. I knew. I just needed to see it with my own eyes, to remove that last tiny doubt that maybe, just maybe, I was wrong. So without telling anyone, without making it obvious, I started adjusting my routine, small changes at first, like coming home a little earlier than usual, parking more quietly, turning off my headlights sooner, even timing when I stepped into the backyard so it wouldn't seem predictable. And for a few days, nothing happened, which almost made me question everything again, like maybe I had imagined the whole pattern. Maybe it really was just some weird coincidence. But then one afternoon, everything finally fell into place. I had gotten off work earlier than expected. The sun was still high but starting to soften, casting long shadows across the houses. And as I pulled into my driveway, something caught my attention out of the corner of my eye, a small, quick movement just beyond the fence line, and instinctively I slowed down, my heart picking up slightly as the strange, almost electric feeling ran through me, like my body already knew what I was about to see before my mind could fully process it. So I stayed in the car for a second longer than usual, engine still running, watching, waiting, barely even breathing, and then it happened so casually, so effortlessly, like it was just another normal part of his day. I saw his arm lift slightly over the fence, and with one simple motion, he tossed something over into my yard, and just like that, it landed somewhere out of my direct sight. But I didn't need to see where it fell because I already knew exactly what it was, and in that moment, everything inside me went completely still. Not explosive, not chaotic, just quiet, like all the questions, all the doubts. All the mental back and forth I had been dealing with for years suddenly disappeared, replaced by one undeniable truth. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't overthinking it. I wasn't being paranoid. He had been doing it all along, and the worst part wasn't even the act itself. It was how normal it looked to him, how routine, like tossing his trash into my yard was just another task to check off his list. No hesitation. No glance over the fence to see if anyone was watching. No guilt, no second thought, just pure, careless disregard. And I remember sitting there gripping the steering wheel a little tighter, my jaw slowly tightening as this wave of heat spread through my chest. Not loud anger, not the kind that makes you shout or slam doors, but the kind that settles deep inside you, heavy and controlled. the kind that doesn't go away quickly, and for a brief second, I considered getting out of the car right then and there, walking straight to the fence, calling him out, forcing him to look at me and explain himself, but just as quickly as that thought came, it faded because I realized something important in that exact moment. Confronting him wouldn't fix anything. It would just give him a chance to deny it, to twist it, to pretend like it never happened. And after everything I had seen, everything I had collected, I didn't want excuses, I didn't want apologies. I didn't even want a conversation. What I wanted was for him to feel it, even if just for a moment, to experience the exact same inconvenience, the same quiet irritation, the same sense of what the hell is this doing here that I had felt over and over again for 5 years. So instead of stepping out of the car, I turned off the engine, took a slow breath, and sat there in silence, letting that realization fully settle in. And when I finally stepped outside, I didn't look toward the fence. I didn't make a sound. I just walked calmly into my backyard, scanning the grass until I found it, lying there like always, another chewed-up piece tossed without care. And as I bent down to pick it up, something about that moment felt different, heavier, more final, like this wasn't just another addition to the collection. This was the last one I needed, the one that confirmed everything, the one that turned suspicion into certainty. And as I dropped it into the container and closed the lid, I didn't feel angry anymore. I didn't feel confused or frustrated or even disrespected. I felt ready, because now there was no doubt left, no hesitation, no reason to hold back. He had made his choice every single time he threw something over that fence, and now I was about to make mine. Once I made that decision, everything became strangely quiet inside my head, like all the frustration and irritation that had been building for years had finally found a direction, and instead of feeling overwhelmed, I felt focused, almost calm in a way that didn't make sense considering what I was about to do. But that's the thing about patience. When you've held something in for that long, when you've swallowed your reactions over and over again, the moment you finally decide to act doesn't feel chaotic. It feels controlled, intentional, and that's exactly how this felt. So over the next few days, I didn't rush into anything. I didn't act out of impulse. Instead, I waited, observed, and most importantly, I prepared, because if I was going to do this, I wasn't going to do it halfway. I wanted it to be clear, undeniable. Something he couldn't ignore or brush off the way he had been doing to me all these years. So one evening, after making sure everything was just right, I finally opened that container again, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't just glance at what was inside. I actually took it all in, every single bone, every piece, every reminder of those small, repeated acts of disrespect stacked together in one place. And it was almost surreal seeing it like that, because what had once seemed like minor inconveniences scattered over time had now turned into something physical, something heavy, something impossible to dismiss. And as I started transferring them into a larger bag, I could feel the weight of it, not just in my hands, but in everything it represented. 5 years of silence, 5 years of being overlooked, 5 years of someone assuming they could do whatever they wanted without consequence. And as I tied that bag shut, a small, steady smile formed on my face, not out of anger but out of certainty, because I knew exactly what was about to happen next. So I waited until the timing felt right, until the neighborhood had settled into that quiet, end-of-day stillness where everything slows down and people retreat into their homes, lights turning on one by one as the sun dips below the horizon. And when I finally stepped outside, the air felt cooler, calmer, almost like the world itself was holding its breath. And for a second, I just stood there in my backyard, looking around at the space that had been mine from the beginning, the space I had protected, cleaned, maintained despite everything. And then my eyes shifted to the fence, that same barrier that had silently carried years of disrespect from one side to the other. And without hesitation, I grabbed the bag, walked over, and placed it down beside me, taking a slow breath before opening it. And as soon as I did, that familiar smell hit me, faint but unmistakable, a mix of old, dried remains and time itself. And instead of recoiling, I just nodded slightly to myself, like this was exactly what needed to happen. So I reached in, grabbed the first piece, and tossed it over the fence, not aggressively, not dramatically, just a simple, controlled motion, the same way he had been doing it all along. And then I did it again and again and again, each throw steady, deliberate, almost rhythmic, like I was undoing something one piece at a time. And as the minutes passed, I could hear them landing on the other side, faint thuds against grass, wood, maybe even concrete. Each one a quiet message being sent back exactly where it came from, and there was something deeply satisfying about it. Not in a loud, triumphant way, but in a calm, grounding way, like I was finally restoring a balance that had been off for far too long. And I didn't rush it, I took my time, letting each motion settle, letting each sound register, because this wasn't just about getting rid of them, this was about making a point, a clear, undeniable one. And as the pile in the bag slowly disappeared, replaced by emptiness, I could feel that same emptiness forming inside me, too, but in the best possible way, like a weight I had been carrying without fully realizing it was finally being lifted, and by the time I reached the last few pieces, my movements had slowed even more, almost intentionally dragging the moment out because I knew once it was done, that chapter would be closed for good. So I picked up the final bone, paused for just a second as I looked at it, and then with one last smooth motion, I tossed it over the fence, listening carefully as it landed on the other side, and just like that it was over. The bag was empty, my yard was clear, and for the first time in years, there was nothing left to pick up, nothing left to collect, nothing left to tolerate. So I tied up the empty bag, took one last look at the fence, and turned back toward my house, not rushing, not looking back, just walking calmly inside as if nothing had happened. But deep down, I knew something had changed, because this time the silence wasn't mine anymore. The next morning felt different, and I noticed it the second I stepped outside, because for the first time in years, there was nothing waiting for me in the grass, no scattered pieces near the fence, no need to scan the ground like I had trained myself to do over time, just a clean, quiet yard exactly the way it should have been from the beginning. And I didn't realize how much that small change would affect me until I stood there for a few seconds longer than usual, taking it in, feeling this subtle sense of relief settle into my chest, like something that had been bothering me in the background for years had finally gone silent. And even though I didn't see him that day, I knew he had noticed. There was no way he couldn't have, because what I returned wasn't small or subtle. It was 5 years' worth of his own actions sitting right there on his side of the fence. Impossible to ignore, impossible to explain away, without confronting the truth of what he had been doing all along. A few days passed before I saw him again, and when I did, it wasn't planned or dramatic. It was one of those ordinary moments where two neighbors just happened to leave their houses at the same time, the kind of situation I would have avoided before without even thinking, but this time I didn't hesitate. I stepped outside, locked my door, and as I turned, there he was, standing near his driveway, and for a brief second, our eyes met. And in that moment, everything that needed to be said passed between us without a single word, because his expression said it all. His face was tight, his jaw slightly clenched, his eyes carrying this mix of irritation and something else, something closer to discomfort. Like he was annoyed but didn't quite know how to handle it, like he wanted to say something but couldn't figure out how without exposing himself. And I'll admit, I had imagined this moment more than once. I had thought about what I would say, how I would respond if he confronted me. But standing there in real life, none of that felt necessary anymore. So I just smiled. Not in a mocking way, not exaggerated or dramatic, just a small, calm smile, the kind you'd give any normal neighbor in passing, and that seemed to throw him off more than anything else, because he didn't respond, he didn't nod, didn't speak, didn't even try to fake politeness. He just looked at me for a second longer than expected before turning away and getting into his car. And as he drove off, I couldn't help but feel this quiet sense of satisfaction settle in, not because I had embarrassed him or caused a scene, but because I didn't have to. The situation spoke for itself, and for the first time, he was the one sitting with that discomfort, that unanswered tension, that awareness of what had happened without being able to openly address it. After that day, something shifted permanently because the bones stopped completely. Not once did I find another piece in my yard, not weeks later, not months later, nothing. And that silence felt different from before, because this time it wasn't something I was forcing on myself. It was something that had been restored, like a boundary that had finally been recognized without needing to be explained out loud. And every time I stepped into my backyard after that, it felt lighter, cleaner, like it truly belonged to me again. And I didn't have to carry that quiet irritation with me anymore. I didn't have to question or doubt or hold things in. It was just done. And the funny thing is, we never talked about it. Not once, not even a passing comment or awkward acknowledgement. And maybe that's what made it even more satisfying, because any conversation would have required him to admit what he had been doing, and he couldn't do that, not without exposing himself. So instead, we both just moved on, existing in that same space but with a completely different understanding, one that didn't need words to be clear. Looking back on it now, I don't see it as some big act of revenge or anything dramatic like that. It was simple, quiet, and honestly fair. I didn't damage anything, didn't cross any lines that hadn't already been crossed first. I just returned what was never mine to begin with. And sometimes, that's all it takes to remind someone that respect isn't optional, it's expected. And if you ignore that for long enough, eventually it comes back to you in ways you didn't anticipate. If this story gave you that quiet sense of satisfaction, go ahead and hit like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments what's the most subtle but satisfying revenge you've ever seen or experienced. Because sometimes, the best payback isn't loud, it's patient.